April 11, 1241. The Sejo River, northeastern Hungary. Dawn has barely broken when the first Mongol drums begin. King Bela IV of Hungary has assembled the largest Christian army in Central Europe. 50,000 soldiers, knights, infantry, Cuman cavalry, Templar warriors, packed behind a fortified bridge, confident in their numbers, trusting in God, and entirely unprepared for what is about to happen to them. The Mongols don't charge. They do something worse. They use catapults to launch flaming tar and Chinese exploding shells, weapons that no European army has ever faced. While Bela's men scramble in confusion and smoke, Subutai Khan completes a secret flanking maneuver he began the night before. Within hours, the Hungarian army collapses. Not in retreat. En route. Knights and foot soldiers are hunted across open fields and butchered as they flee. Bela barely escapes with his life, riding hard toward the Adriatic coast while his kingdom burns behind him. By the time the Mongols finished, somewhere between 15 and 25% of Hungary's entire population was dead. The worst damage was incurred in the plains regions, where 50 to 80% of settlements were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people gone. And then, just as they were preparing to sweep west, into Austria, into Germany, toward the Atlantic, the Mongols turned around and left. Everyone in Europe exhaled and called it a miracle. But the miracle was temporary. And what happened 44 years later, in the winter of 1285, is the story that history almost forgot. Let's establish what everyone believed at the time. The Mongols were, by every military measure available in the 13th century, unstoppable. They had shattered the Khwarezmian Empire, one of the most powerful in the Islamic world, in 3 years. They had swept through Russia, reducing city after city to ash. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, 2 days before Mohi, a combined force of Polish, German, Moravian, and Templar soldiers was annihilated. Contemporaries compared those two defeats to a biblical plague. The Mongol military system was a masterpiece of engineered violence. Reconnaissance networks that operated weeks ahead of armies. Feigned retreats so practiced they were indistinguishable from real ones. Horse archers who could ride at full gallop and put 3 arrows into a man-shaped target in less than 4 seconds. And above all, speed. They moved faster than their enemies could think. Against that kind of force, Europe had exactly one answer: stone walls. And in 1241, Hungary barely had any. The only places that held in the face of Mongol assaults were approximately 80 fortified places, including all of the few stone castles in the kingdom. In an entire country. Most Hungarian defenses were wooden palisades, earthen mounds, and clay walls, structures that Mongol engineers had been defeating for decades. So when the Mongols sent ultimatum after ultimatum to Hungary in the 1250s and 1260s, demanding submission, demanding a quarter of the kingdom's army, demanding tribute, most of Europe assumed the outcome was already written. Hungary was a wounded kingdom with a traumatized king and a population that had been halved in places. The Mongols controlled the steppes to the east. They had allies and intelligence networks inside Hungary's borders. They had done it once. Everyone assumed they would do it again. Here's what really happened. The figure at the center of this story is not a great general. He is not a battle hero. He is a bureaucrat of catastrophe, a king who survived the worst military defeat in his country's history and spent the rest of his reign quietly doing the most unglamorous thing imaginable: building. King Bela IV returned to a kingdom in ruins in 1242. He had watched Mongol horse archers ride through his country for a full year. He had watched wooden walls collapse under Mongol siege engines. He had watched his knights, some of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, get picked apart by light horsemen who simply refused to close into melee range. He understood, with the clarity of a man who has barely survived, exactly what had gone wrong. Open ground kills armies. Stone kills Mongols. The threat of another Mongol invasion, this time taken seriously, was the source of national unity and provided the impetus for Bela IV's extensive expansion of Hungarian defenses, especially the building of new stone castles, 44 in the first 10 years, and the revitalization of the army, including expanding the number of heavily armored cavalry and knights in the royal army. 44 stone castles in 10 years. Consider the logistics of that. In a country still recovering from famine, depopulation, and economic collapse. With a treasury that was partially depleted. With nobles who were reluctant to fund projects they didn't control. With no guarantee the Mongols would ever actually return. Bela didn't just build castles. He gave power away to make it happen. He granted nobles the right to build their own fortifications on their own land in exchange for the obligation to man and defend them. He was, in effect, trading royal authority for a distributed defense network, accepting political weakness to purchase military strength. His contemporaries thought it was a questionable trade. Future generations would call him the second founder of Hungary. But that was just the beginning. By the 1280s, nearly half a century had passed since Mohi. Bela IV was long dead. His successors had continued the building program, sometimes effectively, sometimes chaotically, but the network of stone fortifications had grown dramatically across the kingdom. In the mountains, along river crossings, in the passes of the Carpathians, in Transylvania. When Nogai Khan decided to invade in the winter of 1285, he was working from intelligence that was dangerously out of date. His sources inside Hungary told him that the political situation was disastrous. Nogai had been told of the perilous political situation in Hungary by fleeing Cuman warriors. King Ladislaus IV's nobles were practically rebelling against him, and Hungary had just been weakened by a Cuman rebellion they had recently defeated, and planned to capitalize on it by launching a vast campaign against the apparently weakened kingdom. This was accurate intelligence. Hungary's internal politics in the 1280s were genuinely chaotic. King Ladislaus IV, called the Cuman because of his nomadic lifestyle and Cuman mistresses, had alienated the Catholic Church, abandoned his wife, and was being threatened with a crusade by his own archbishop. On paper, the kingdom was fractured. What Nogai's intelligence did not capture was the physical transformation of the country beneath the political turmoil. He planned a three-pronged invasion, a deliberate echo of the 1241 campaign. Nogai himself would drive through Transylvania in the south. His co-commander Tulabuga would lead the main column through northern Hungary via Transcarpathia. A third, smaller force would mirror the central route that had worked so devastatingly before. The plan was tactically sound. It had worked before, against a Hungary with wooden walls. It was about to meet a Hungary that had spent 4 decades building in stone. The second discovery, Mongol armies in the winter of 1285 were not the same beast as Subutai's forces in 1241. Defensive efficacy thus hinged on passive measures. Dispersed garrisons in hilltop strongholds like those in the Carpathians and Transylvania, which Mongols proved unable to breach without prolonged sieges ill-suited to their winter campaign. The Mongols had always relied on speed and logistical efficiency. A prolonged siege meant stationary armies. Stationary armies meant supply lines. Supply lines in a Hungarian winter, through Carpathian mountain passes, were brittle things. The third discovery, the Mongol command was fractured in ways that would prove decisive. Failures were attributed to poor coordination among the commanders. Nogai and Tulabuga were not unified in strategy or temperament. They were, in some ways, rivals, two powerful figures in a golden horde that was itself fragmenting under weak central leadership. That internal tension would compound every military setback. When the armies crossed the Carpathians in early February 1285, the cascade began. Tulabuga's northern column hit the Carpathian passes first, and the passes hit back. The winter of 1285 was severe. The mountain routes that Mongol scouts had mapped were choked with heavy snow. Tulabuga, who led the main army in northern Hungary, was stopped by the heavy snow of the Carpathians. An army built for mobility across open steppe ground was now threading through narrow mountain corridors in brutal cold, horses struggling, supply wagons bogged, the element of surprise evaporating with every slow mile. When Tulabuga finally descended into the Hungarian lowlands, he found something the 1241 campaign never encountered: a fortified country that simply would not open for him. The Mongol forces were unable to take any major stone castles or fortified cities and suffered from supply shortages, sallies by local Hungarian forces, and stiff resistance in any castle or town they assaulted. Think about what this meant operationally. The Mongol cavalry model depended on living off the land, foraging from the countryside, keeping supply lines minimal, moving fast enough that the enemy never consolidated. But when every town is a fortified position and every castle requires weeks of siege work, the cavalry cannot forage. There is no open countryside to strip. The army is forced to stop. And a stopped Mongol army begins to starve. The Mongols had faced stone walls before, in China, in Persia, in Russia. But they had always brought siege engineers, time, and overwhelming resources. In Hungary in 1285, they had a winter campaign with degraded supply lines, political divisions at the command level, and a distributed defense network that had no single throat to cut. Every day they spent outside a Hungarian castle was a day their horses weren't eating, a day their men were burning calories in freezing temperatures, a day the local Hungarian forces were organizing. And those local forces, the Saxons of Transylvania, the Szekelys in the mountain passes, the Vlachs, the local noble levies under Voivode Roland Borsa, knew their terrain in ways no steppe army ever could. They didn't need to defeat the Mongols in pitched battle. They simply needed to deny them food, block their retreat routes, and let the winter do the work. Tulabuga's army reached Pest, stood outside its walls and stared at fortifications it could not breach. A charter of Queen Elizabeth, wife of King Ladislaus IV, recorded seeing two Mongol armies meeting outside the walls of Pest, a remarkable moment, Nogai's and Tulabuga's forces linking up before a city that refused to fall. Then King Ladislaus IV struck with the royal army. The invading force was defeated near Pest by the royal army of Ladislaus IV and ambushed by the Szekelys in the return. The Szekelys were a Magyar ethnic group settled in Transylvania specifically to guard the eastern passes, warriors who had been defending that mountain territory for generations. As Tulabuga's shattered columns tried to retreat back through the Carpathians, the Szekelys were waiting in the same passes the Mongols had used to enter. The hunters became the hunted in corridors of rock and snow. The Halic Volhynian Chronicle, probably with a great degree of hyperbole, says Tolibuka escaped with only a mare and one of his wives. Whatever the literal truth, the symbolism is accurate. The main Mongol column, which had arrived expecting to repeat 1241, was shattered. Nogai's southern column fared better, He was a more skilled and cautious commander than Tulabuga, and his forces managed to plunder several towns in Transylvania before being forced out. Nogai stayed in Hungary into spring and retained the bulk of his army, but still suffered several serious reverses at the hands of local Hungarian troops. He too failed to take any major fortifications except one minor Saxon castle. Local Hungarian forces, the Saxons, Vlachs, and Szekelys under Voivode Roland Borsa, hit him repeatedly in ambushes and field engagements until he chose to withdraw. The results of the invasion could not have contrasted more sharply with those of the 1241 invasion. The invasion was repelled handily, and the Mongols lost much of their invading force due to several months of starvation, numerous small raids, and 2 major military defeats. The force that had terrorized Europe for 40 years, that had shattered Russia, Poland, and Hungary in sequence, withdrew from a 2-month campaign having failed to take a single major fortification, having lost an enormous portion of its army, and having achieved nothing that lasted. The failed Mongol attack on Hungary greatly reduced the Golden Horde's military power and caused them to stop disputing Hungarian borders. No major invasion of Hungary would ever come again. Here is where the history gets complicated in ways that matter. The standard version of this story, when it is told at all, presents 1285 as Hungary's vindication. Bela forebuilt castles, castles stopped Mongols, Hungary won. Causal. Satisfying. But the real story is stranger and more instructive. The stone castle network that defeated the 1285 invasion was built by giving away power. Bela Ivy's decision to let nobles build and control their own fortifications, to solve the military problem of centralized wooden walls by distributing fortification authority across hundreds of independent lords, created a defense system that worked brilliantly in 1285. It also created a nobility that was far more powerful, far more independent, and far more fractious than any Hungarian king would want. The political chaos that Nogai exploited as his casus belli in 1285, Ladislaus IV embattled by his own nobles, threatened with crusade by his own archbishop, was a direct consequence of the same reforms that made the defense possible. The solution to one catastrophe had, over 40 years, generated the conditions for a different kind of crisis. This is not unusual. It is, in fact, almost universal. Bela IV is seen now as a second founder of the nation, partly in recognition of all that was done during his reign to reconstruct and fortify the country against foreign invasion from the east. What is less often discussed is that the second founder phase required accepting a radical reorganization of who held power and how. Bela didn't just rebuild Hungary's walls. He rebuilt Hungary's political architecture, and the architecture he built would generate its own tensions for generations. There is something else worth examining. Why Nogai thought this was a good idea in the first place? He had reliable intelligence about Hungary's internal weakness. His sources were correct about the political situation. What his intelligence network fundamentally failed to capture was the material transformation of the country, the physical reality of 44 stone castles in the first decade alone, more built every year after, spread across mountains and river crossings and strategic passes. Intelligence about politics was visible. Intelligence about stone was harder to gather from the steppe. Nogai made the classic mistake of the overconfident. He assumed the future would resemble the past because the past had been so decisive. 1241 was so total, so overwhelming, that it seemed to establish a permanent truth about the military relationship between the Mongols and Hungary. He updated his intelligence on Hungary's political weakness without sufficiently updating his assumptions about Hungary's military capability. The gap between what he knew and what had changed is where the campaign died. And then there is the question of what 1285 actually did to the Golden Horde, the piece of the story that typically gets overlooked entirely. Upon returning from their disastrous campaign in Hungary, they found Tudamengu Khan sunk in religious torpor. Later in the year, he relinquished the throne to his nephew, Talabuga. The failure in Hungary destabilized the political structure of the Golden Horde itself. Talabuga, humiliated by the campaign and eager to prove himself, immediately launched another doomed military adventure against the Ilkhanate. The internal rivalries between Nogai and Talabuga deepened. The horde that entered Hungary in 1285 as the dominant military force in Eastern Europe left it fractured, diminished, and politically convulsed. One campaign, 2 months, changed the trajectory of the most powerful military organization in the medieval world. This is the history that tends to get lost between 1241 and the eventual decline of Mongol power in Europe. We focus on the catastrophe of 1241 and the drama of the Black Death and the rise of Ottoman power. We skip over 1285 as a footnote, a second invasion, quickly repelled, barely noted. But 1285 is where something important happened. A kingdom that had been devastated proved that devastation is not destiny. That the same force which destroyed you can be beaten, if you are willing to do the unsexy work of rebuilding in the interval, building in stone when there's no enemy in sight, accepting political costs for military necessity, distributing defensive capability even when centralized control feels safer. The Mongols didn't lose because Hungary got lucky. They lost because Hungary spent 43 years becoming a different country than the one they remembered. What they invaded in 1285 wasn't the Hungary of 1241. It was a Hungary that had used catastrophe as instruction. The physical fortifications were the visible expression of something harder to quantify. A kingdom that had looked at its own near annihilation, absorbed the lesson, and systematically changed the things that had made it vulnerable. Bela IV never saw 1285. He died in 1270. He built the walls that would stop an invasion he never lived to see defeated. That is perhaps the most important detail of all. The work of adaptation doesn't always pay off in the lifetime of the person who does it. The 40-year infrastructure project. The political compromises that feel like weakness. The stone castles built for an enemy that might never come back. The preparation that looks, until the moment it is tested, like paranoia. Until February 1285. When Talabuga's army appeared outside Pest and found walls that would not fall. And the Mongols, who had swept across the known world, turned around and went home. And never came back.